Hello and welcome to the race edition of the Race Weekend Data Analysis for the British Grand Prix. The series in which we delve on into all of the race data, positional charts, lap time charts, clean air laps as well, in addition to comparing all of the teammates together. Everything is timestamped in the description down below, so feel free to skip to whichever section of the video you would like me to talk about. But without further ado, let us jump on into the race data for the British Grand Prix. And we start, of course, with the normal positions chart, and we can see that Charles Leclerc led literally every lap apart from the last three. We see a couple of pit stops in the first stage of the Grand Prix from about lap 16 to about lap 20. There were then a couple from about 26 to 30, and then there were a few late pit stops as well, around laps 44 to 48. But from the positions charts, we'll now quickly take a look at the overall lap time chart. And here we can see that main bulk of pit stops where everyone changed from the mediums to their hards. From about laps 18 to 32, there were then a couple of the straggly pit stops as well at the end of the race. But just taking a more zoomed in look at the overall lap times, excluding all of the pit stops, we can see that it looks a little bit like this. And there is actually 4 distinct bands of racing in the first stint of the Grand Prix. At the very top, we have the 2 Haas cars that are well over a second off of the pace from the next slowest car, which is cars like the Alpines and then also the Alfa Tauris. With that second from bottom group being Carlos Sainz and also Daniel Ricciardo, with the bottom group the fastest set of people being the 2 Mercedes, Lando Norris and also Charles Leclerc. This translates into a group of 3 by the mid portion of the pit stops, and then roughly expands into maybe 4 if you want to be a little bit picky, with Lewis Hamilton at least half a second a lap quicker than anybody else from about laps 34 all the way up to lap 46 after he made the pass on Charles Leclerc. Mainly because after he'd got past, there is absolutely no need to be travelling that quickly. But at the request of one of my Discord members, links to that down in the description below, we'll now take a look at those last 20 or so laps. This is from laps 28 to laps 51, after Hamilton has served his penalty and he is storming up to Charles Leclerc. So Lewis Hamilton is that blue line at the bottom. We can see he had a vaguely slow lap at lap number 32, but then consistently from laps 34 up until 46, he was at least half a second faster than anybody else on the track, with Charles Leclerc being the darker blue line, who's currently running in P1 at the time, and then the orange line, who is at the same pace as Charles Leclerc. That is Valtteri Bottas. So this just goes to show how much quicker Lewis Hamilton was going compared to the other 2, and Valtteri Bottas also keeping a consistent pace with Charles Leclerc. But now what we can do is we can isolate each of those drivers' clean air lap times and then average them out and work out all of their percentages, etc. And that is displayed on screen here. So Lewis Hamilton was declared the fastest driver in clean air for the British Grand Prix, where again a clean air lap was set any lap outside of 2 seconds of the car ahead. Apologies if there are a couple cars whizzing past. It is excruciatingly hot today. It's currently 28 or 29 degrees as I am recording this, and I do not want to close my window. We then interestingly had Sergio Perez running in P2. He had the pace for P2 had he started up there. Instead, he started down in the pit lane and then pitted for that fastest lap. We then had Valtteri Bottas ahead of Charles Leclerc, with Yuki Tsunoda, interestingly, very high up in the pace leaderboard. So we've got their average lap column here, we've got their gap to the right of it, and then to the right of the gaps we have it in terms of a percentage, which I can then later compare to the other tracks of this season. We then have the number of clean air laps that each driver had. So Lewis Hamilton in this entire Grand Prix had 20, Sergio Perez had 8, Bottas 23, etc, etc. There is then a percentage column of the total length of the Grand Prix, and then there's the standard deviation, which just shows how consistent they were throughout their clean air laps. But taking that middle percentage column and averaging it with the remaining races that we have had this season, we end up with an overall pace leaderboard that looks a little bit like this. Hamilton has clawed himself a little bit closer to Sergio Perez, and Sergio Perez obviously has gone a little bit closer to Verstappen, as Verstappen didn't set any laps. And then doing the exact same for the teams, we see that Mercedes has taken just a little step closer towards Red Bull. They were at 0.36% behind, they are now 0.27, with Ferrari still having the third fastest car, but McLaren managing to outperform them. But the next graphic on screen just shows the visualization of where those clean air laps for each of the drivers fell, and we can see that for those that set their clean air laps in the first half of the Grand Prix, they're obviously going to have a slightly lower average time than people who set their clean air laps in the second half, mainly because different tyres and also lower fuel loads. Now, I am currently working on a way to account for the fuel loads, but time is my enemy at the moment, so I'm looking at implementing that after the summer break. So what I've currently worked out at the moment is an overall stint breakdown. So for stint number 1 on the mediums, it was actually Valtteri Bottas who was the fastest in clean air, and then Lewis Hamilton, followed by Carlos Sainz. And then drivers with a bracketed asterisk by their name are drivers who did set laps on those tyres, however they did not set any clean air laps on those tyres. Then from stint number 1 we can take a look at stint number 2, where everybody bar Sergio Perez is on the hard compound of tyre, and this is where Lewis Hamilton ramped up his pace. He was 6 tenths faster than actually Yuki Tsunoda, who was going incredibly quick on his hard compound of tyres in clean air, compared to Valtteri Bottas and Charles Leclerc, who were exceptionally similar. There was just half a tenth difference between the two drivers, and they both had comparative numbers of clean air laps, 22 for the Finn and 20 for the Monegasque. Now, there were, of course, drivers who did 3 or even 4 stints in the case of Sergio Perez. However, as there is nothing to compare them to, I have not included them in this video. So with the clean air lap analysis all done and dusted, we are now going to take a look at each of the teams and a teammate comparison. We're going in 2020 Constructors' Championship order, so we'll start with the Mercedes and we'll end with Williams. Like I said, everything is timestamped in the description below, so feel free to skip to whichever one you would like me to talk about. So on screen now is the Mercedes race panel. In the top left, we have their laps chart, with Valtteri Bottas in the turquoise and Lewis Hamilton in the black. In the grey dotted line is their previous pace at the 2020 British Grand Prix. Now, this is the British Grand Prix, not the 70th anniversary Grand Prix, as I wanted to make sure it was the same race with the same compound of tyres used. And in this weekend's Grand Prix, it was the C1 to C3 tyres, and then in the British Grand Prix of 2020, it was also the C1 to the C3s. Then below that, we have the gaps between each of the two Mercedes on each of the individual laps. Again, Lewis Hamilton in the black and Valtteri Bottas in the turquoise. The top right, we have their positions chart, and then in the bottom right, we have the overall pace percentage difference from Hamilton to Bottas. So this takes all of Lewis Hamilton's lap times, it divides them all by Valtteri Bottas's lap times, converts them into a percentage, and then orders them from largest down to smallest. Any percentage above 100 is when Lewis Hamilton is going faster, and then any percentage below 100 is when Valtteri Bottas is going faster. And we can split this percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for exactly 25% of the Grand Prix, it was Valtteri Bottas who was the faster car, and then for 75% exactly, it was Lewis Hamilton. With, interestingly, both drivers being exceptionally even in stint number 1 up until Valtteri Bottas's pit stop first. However, the gap did steadily rise over about 20 laps to just over 5 seconds. Bottas then came in for his pit stop first, which rose the gap to well over 25. Then Lewis Hamilton came back in which Valtteri Bottas was the car ahead because Lewis Hamilton had to serve his 10-second stop and go. 10-second time penalty, not stop and go. However, post Lewis Hamilton's time penalty pit stop, he then goes ham. And obviously we do have that little spike from Valtteri Bottas, which is the team order pass on Lewis Hamilton, and then Hamilton just absolutely storms away from Valtteri Bottas at about half a second to a second per lap, raising the gap from nothing at lap 40 to just over 10 seconds at the checkered flag. But taking a look at the overall Mercedes lap times and comparing it to their 2020 pace, they were a tenth slower than their 2020 pace, with 2020 being a 1 minute 30 flat in clean air and Lewis Hamilton setting a 1 minute 30.8. With Valtteri Bottas being just over half a second slower in clean air overall, with a stint 1 comparison looking a bit like this, Bottas actually the quicker car by just over a tenth, and stint number 2, it was Hamilton who absolutely destroyed by just over 0.6 of a second. Then from Mercedes, we can take a look at Red Bull, and unfortunately, there is always one team that never has any data for their teammate comparisons, and today that just so happens to be Red Bull, as Max Verstappen retired on lap number 1. So the only thing that we can really do is compare the overall clean air lap pace of Sergio Perez to 2020, and 2020's pace for the Red Bull was 1.3 seconds quicker than what Perez did in 2021. Then from Red Bull, we will take a look at the Orange Papaya McLaren team, and even though it was a much stronger performance from Daniel Ricciardo, if we split their percentage pace difference down the middle, it was still only 23.1% of the laps where he was the quicker car, and for 76.9% it was Lando Norris. So even though his position is there, his pace versus Lando Norris is not quite there yet, with there being a fairly sizable gulf between the two drivers in the first opening stint, which rose the gap from, again, just over 1 second, maybe 2 seconds, to about 10 at the first pit stop. Where it is actually Daniel Ricciardo who comes in first, which spikes the gap in Lando Norris's favour to just about 35 seconds, and then post-pit stop, it's again Lando Norris who is fairly consistently quicker, apart from a lap on lap 32. I'm not entirely sure what that was for. It was just one extremely slow lap by about 2 seconds compared to his remaining pace. Then in the closing 5 or 6 laps of the Grand Prix, Daniel Ricciardo was able to match Lando Norris's pace, and then in the last couple, he was actually going considerably quicker. Then taking a look at the overall McLaren's pace, they are again, like Red Bull, 1.2 seconds slower than their 2020 pace, which is an absolutely enormous pace difference considering Mercedes were only 0.8 a lap quicker in 2020. There was an almost 0.3 of a second difference between Norris and Ricciardo over the whole Grand Prix. With stint number 1, there was actually an 0.8 difference, Ricciardo really not enjoying his stint number 1. However, at stint number 2, when they went onto the hards, he was much more comfortable. Still not quite as quick, but much more comfortable, and only 0.2 a lap slower than Lando Norris. Then from McLaren, we'll take a look at Aston Martin, and then splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, for the laps that they were running together up until Sebastian Vettel DNF'd, Lance Stroll was the quicker car for 75% of those laps, with Sebastian Vettel therefore being quicker for 25% of those laps. With again stint number 1 between the Aston Martins being exceptionally even. However, Vettel did come in for an extremely early pit stop just after the red flag restart, with the spike in the positions chart for Sebastian Vettel being his little pirouette after attacking Fernando Alonso, which is highlighted just here on the lap time chart, which is the steep increase for Sebastian Vettel, which looks like a pit stop, but is not a pit stop. It is then Lance Stroll who comes in for his stop just a couple of laps later. Then post Lance Stroll pit stop, they are actually running exceptionally even. Sebastian Vettel a little bit on the inconsistent side in lap times compared to Lance Stroll, but the gap hovering at a steady 16 seconds. Then unfortunately Sebastian Vettel did have to retire, with the overall Aston Martin pace looking a little bit like this, their 2020 pace being 0.9 of a lap quicker. Now sadly Sebastian Vettel didn't really set that many competitive clean air lap times whatsoever, as demonstrated by him being 4.2 seconds behind, which is not really representative at all. And then exactly the same in stint number 1. They were exceptionally even looking at the lap time charts, however he didn't really run in clean air and was 1.2 seconds behind Stroll, and unfortunately in stint number 2 he didn't set any competitive clean air lap times. So from Aston Martin, we'll now take a look at Alpine, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, for the very first time this season, we have a dead 50-50 split. We've had close to 50-50 splits before. We've had 51-49, we've had 50.5, 49.5, but this is the very first time that we have had a dead 50-50 split. They were both as quick as each other. But looking at their lap time charts, Alonso in the dark line is just a squidge quicker in the first stint a little bit, accelerating that gap to just over 5 seconds. It is Esteban Ocon in the white who comes in first, which spikes the gap to about 28, and then it is Fernando Alonso who comes in just a couple of laps after. Then post Alonso pit stop, it is Ocon who runs just a squidge faster by probably a 10th or 2 per lap, which decreases the gap from 5 seconds to about 3, and then it raises again to 4 at the checkered flag. So a much better race for Esteban Ocon, and the two Alpines dead even. With comparing their pace to 2020, 2020 was 1.1 seconds a lap quicker, so a little bit faster than the McLarens and the Red Bulls, but a little bit slower than the Mercedes and the Aston Martins. With Ocon being just over a tenth a lap slower in clean air across the whole Grand Prix to Fernando Alonso. However, much like Daniel Ricciardo, he was significantly slower in stint number 1, 0.6 of a second. However, in stint number 2, he actually turns that around and he was the quicker car by just 0.02 of a second per lap. And these are the types of performances that Alpine were looking for with Esteban Ocon. And then from Alpine, we'll take a look at the Scuderia Ferrari, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, for 19.2% of the Grand Prix, it is Carlos Sainz in the black line who is the faster car, and then for 80.8%, it is Charles Leclerc. And we can see an enormous pace gap between the two cars. This is almost a second per lap in the opening stint for the first 16 laps. That is absolutely ridiculous. And then at about laps 20, they even out, with Sainz finding a lot of pace and Charles Leclerc backing off just a little bit. He did have his engine issues throughout this portion of the Grand Prix where he was having to change all sorts of settings, so that is potentially why Charles Leclerc slowed down just a touch. They both came in for their pit stops around the same time, with interestingly Carlos Sainz coming in first before Charles Leclerc, and then post pit stop, once again there is just an enormous pace gulf between the two, about half a second this time, not as big as stint number 1, but still hefty. With interestingly Charles Leclerc slowing right down after being passed by Lewis Hamilton. He slowed down by about 2 or 3 seconds per lap. With the overall Ferrari pace looking a little bit like this, 2020 was 0.9 a lap quicker than their 2021 pace. With Carlos Sainz being 3.5 slower across the whole Grand Prix in clean air, with stint number 1, Sainz was actually the quicker car overall by just over 0.1 of a second. And then in stint number 2, Sainz never set any clean air laps in stint number 2. So hopefully Ferrari can keep up this momentum going into Hungary and actually claw back some of those points against McLaren. And then from Ferrari, we'll take a look at Alfa Tauri. Splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 28.8% of the Grand Prix, it is Yuki Tsunoda in the white who is the faster car, and then for 71.2%, it is Pierre Gasly, which seems like a fairly significant pace difference. However, if we look at stint number 1, they were very even. Yes, the gap was about 4 or 5 seconds, however it stayed at about 4 or 5 seconds for around 20 laps. It is Gasly in the black who comes in first a couple of laps before Yuki Tsunoda. However, it is the second stop, the second phase of this Grand Prix, where Pierre Gasly accelerates his advantage over Yuki Tsunoda. Unfortunately for Pierre Gasly, he has a second stop due to a puncture, which actually puts Yuki Tsunoda ahead overall and is able to score that final point. Otherwise, that would have been Pierre Gasly's. With the overall AlphaTauri pace looking a little bit like this, 2020 being 1.5 seconds quicker, the overall biggest loss so far that we have looked at this race. With Yuki Tsunoda being overall the faster car this Grand Prix in clean air over the whole Grand Prix distance, and stint number 1, much the same, he was the quicker car by 1.5 tenths, and then in stint number 2, he was quicker by 1.3 seconds, which is absolutely enormous for the second stint. Then we'll take a look at Alfa Romeo, and we can split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 45.1% it was Giovinazzi in the white who was the faster car, and then for 54.9% it was Kimi Räikkönen in the red. And this is back to normal for the Alfa Romeos. They have been exceptionally even this whole season. This has basically been their average pace difference so far. With stint number 1, both drivers just absolutely dead even, the gap staying between 2 and 4 seconds for about 16 to 20 laps, right up until the first pit stop, an early stop actually, from Kimi Räikkönen. Giovinazzi in the white comes in on lap 24, just a couple of laps after, and then in the second phase of the Grand Prix, they are exchanging being the quicker car. Sometimes it is Kimi Raikkonen for a handful of laps, and then the next handful of laps, it is Giovinazzi who is going quicker. So again, that gap hovers around 2 to 4 seconds for about 20 to 30 laps. Kimi Raikkonen then notably has his little incident with Sergio Perez, which is that spike on the right of their lap time chart, with the overall 2020 pace for the Alfa Romeo being 1.9 seconds quicker than their 2021 pace, even more significant than the Alfa Tauri time loss, with Giovinazzi being just about 0.4 a lap slower than Raikkonen across the whole Grand Prix, and stint number 1, he was a little bit closer, he was 1/10 slower than Kimi Raikkonen, and then stint number 2, he was 0.5 down on Kimi Raikkonen. Then penultimately, we can take a look at Haas, and we can split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 41.2%, it was Nikita Mazepin in the white, who was the faster of the two cars, and then for 58.8%, it was Mick Schumacher. Now, interestingly, even though Nikita Mazepin finished in front of Mick by about a second in this Grand Prix, he was never always the quicker car. And we can see that in stint number 1, they were both exceptionally even, the gap staying just below 3 seconds up until the first round of pit stops, in which Mick comes in first and then Mazepin comes in second, which is where the positional swap happens. Then post this pit stop, neither driver really encounters many blue flag issues. They encounter one together at around lap 38, and then that's about it. They never really encounter any more, so both drivers were exceptionally consistent this Grand Prix, which is definitely different to the trend this season. However, if we take a look at the comparison to their 2020 pace, they lost 3.9 seconds. Almost 4 seconds per lap. That is an absolutely horrendous time loss. The next closest team in terms of time loss was Alfa Romeo at 1.9. That is a full 2 seconds different, with Mick Schumacher uncharacteristically being the slower of the two cars over the whole race distance, 1.6 seconds behind in clean air, with stint number 1, Schumacher being 6.5 down on the medium compound, and then stint number 2, he was down by 1.5 seconds. Admittedly, Schumacher didn't have a great deal of clean air laps in the second half of the Grand Prix compared to Mazepin, but in the first half, they had a fairly comparative amount. And then finally, we'll take a look at Williams, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 49% exactly, it was Nicholas Latifi in the blue, who was the faster of the two cars, and for 51% exactly, it was George Russell in the white. With the overall pace of the two cars in stint number 1, again being exceptionally even, staying at 2 seconds consistently. They then both come into the pits one lap after the other, with Russell coming in first and Latifi coming in second, and then post pit stop, as evident by their lap time charts, they were just dead even. Sometimes Latifi was about 0.5 to 1/10 quicker, sometimes it was George Russell, right up until lap 44, where something happens to Nicholas Latifi, and I'm not quite sure what. George Russell somehow picks up the pace, and Latifi sort of drops off just a little bit. With, interestingly, Williams, compared to their 2020 pace, losing 2.1 seconds, so just a little bit worse than the Alfa Romeos, but nowhere near as worse as the Haas. With, interestingly, Nicholas Latifi having the advantage over George Russell in terms of clean air running across the whole race distance. With stint number 1, Latifi unfortunately not setting any clean air laps in stint number 1, and then in stint number 2 the gap was just 0.03 of a second. So the two Williams were exceptionally close. Latifi has very good race pace, he just doesn't really show it in qualifying. And there we go, there is all of the race data all concluded for the British Grand Prix. Please let me know in the comments down below what you found most interesting about the data analysis. And that is all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.